Hey, it's Kevin DeWitt here. Welcome to another plugin knowledge session. This week, we're going to look at iZotope Neutron, the equalizer section. So in previous plugin knowledge sessions, I looked at an overview, and this time we are going to look specifically at the equalizer section. And there'll be more videos along this where we will look at the other components of Neutron, because it's such an advanced plugin. It's impossible to cover everything in one of these sessions. Okay, so obviously you've got a visual representation here, especially when you have some audio playing. So if I was to just start this song, you get a nice spectral waveform there, so you can see what's going on, and you can change how this is represented, what the scale is, etc. But I'll just leave it at default. We have lots of bands here. So we've got 8 bands of EQ, we've got shelf, we've got filters, lots and lots of possibilities. You can pretty much do anything you like with this. And you've got presets that are stored here just for the equalizer. You can adjust the blend of the equalizer, so you could actually just blend in a small portion of the equalizer into the main signal, and you can obviously turn it on or off, and you can place it anywhere you like, but that's more shown in the overview. So let's start with the filter here. So the filter section, we can turn it on or off simply like that, and we have all these settings here. So basically we have our slope settings. So we've got a 6 dB, 12 dB, 24 dB, 48 dB, and then a resonant. So obviously the bigger the number, the sharper the filter. The lower the number, the wider the filter. Now we can adjust the frequency here. And this frequency value here is usually expressed at 3 dB drop. So let's say this is 3 dB somewhere around here. That would be about the setting that you've set this frequency at. We can also grab it from the display here and move it, and you'll see there it's giving us an accurate reading on the screen right where my mouse is to tell us all the values, and even tell us the musical note. You'll see there's G1. So not only is it telling us the frequency, it's telling us the musical note as well. Okay, and that's basically the limit that we can do with the filter. Okay, with this Q setting here does not do anything. This dynamic section, and that does not do anything on a filter either. The resonant section is an interesting one because that does start to open some things up. So again, we can change our frequency here. And what a resonant does is basically, as the picture describes here, it does a little bit of a boost at the point of where we're setting our frequency to cut. So as it's doing the filter, it does a boost above that. And based on this Q setting here, determines how much of that resonance is added. So this can be really useful if you want to, say, bring out a kick drum or something like that. You could find the fundamental frequency of the kick drum. Let's say it was at 60 Hertz. So it will do a boost to 60 Hertz, but then quickly filter out anything below 60 Hertz. So you'll get a really nice, powerful thump kick drum, but it's also clean. It's very clean on the bottom end because it's filtered out all of that rumble underneath, but really put a resonance peak there, a bit of a boost at the primary frequency. So you could put that anywhere you like. It's going to just depend on what your instrument, the kick drum or whatever else you're trying to target, and how you want it to sound. And we have similar settings on the other end as well. So we can do the same thing on the top end. Exactly the same settings, frequency, set it to resonance. We can change the Q on that as well. So we can get that same effect, but at the top end. Then next we have a shelf. So again, we can turn it on or off. we have 3 types of shelf. Now you can see here, it gives us a good indication of what the shelf's going to do by the pictures. Okay, so we've got our standard shelf, we've got a Baxendale shelf, and we've got a vintage. Now we can set our frequency again, anywhere in the EQ. Again, we can drag this little ball here on the screen as well. We can bring it up and down and move it across. We can even grab these little circles on the side here to adjust the Q. So, and you'll see that it's moving the controls down here as I'm doing it. So, as you can see there, we can move our frequency. We can move our frequency from here. We can change our gain. We can go negative with a shelf. We can go positive with a shelf. And then we can change our Q, which is basically adjusting the slope of our shelf. And like I said, we can do that from here. We can do the gain from here as well. And then we can change our type. So we could go for a Baxendale there. And there's our gain. Now you can see there's a little bit, so it's a very wide Q on this one. We don't have an adjustment. It's basically locked in. So a very wide Q shelf, the Baxendale, but it does also a little bit of a dip here. Just as it's coming out of the shelf, it does a bit of a dip. So it's sort of cleaning up this area while boosting this area. And that is determined by how much we do, but also the position a bit. Okay, but if we go into a negative value, we don't get a peak. So it's not like a resonance or anything like that. It's a little bit different. So it only does that little dip when we go into a positive shelf. If we go into a negative, we don't get that. And then we have our vintage style. Now this one is more a resonance filter here, and this one we actually do have the ability to adjust the Q to a wider one, so we don't get any resonance, or sharper, so we do get resonance. And again, we can boost and we can cut. This one will do a resonance peak there on this shelf. And again, we have exactly the same settings on the top end as well. Now with these shelves, we now open up this dynamic section, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. So I'm going to ignore that for the moment, but we'll come back to that. So then we have our 8 bands. They are all identical. They all have the exactly same abilities, and none of them are locked in. Some EQs will lock certain bands to a specific position, and they might even name them, like this might be named LF, low frequency. This might be LMF, low mid frequency. This might be mid frequency. Some EQs lock them in. This one doesn't. So you could put 1 up here, 3 down here, 7 down here. It doesn't matter. You can put them anywhere you like. So if we have a look at 1 here, basically we can again drag it up and down with our Q. We can go negative, positive. We can do that from this control here. Again, the knobs here can adjust our Q and our Q here. And we can do it from this control as well. We can also move our frequency from this control. And then we have 2 types. We have a band shelf and a proportional Q. Again, the pictures sort of give you an indication, but let's have a look at a band shelf. So a band shelf, basically, they're calling it that because it's similar to a shelf, except it has a top and bottom range. It doesn't just shelf all the way down, but it does have this little flat top here, and you can make that wider. And that's why it's referred to as a band. So a band EQ is usually where it has it does a portion of the EQ. It doesn't covers a range of EQ. So again, very simple. We've got our gain, we've got our Q, nothing major there. It's just a matter of where we place it and how wide we want it to look. Now, a proportional Q refers to the fact that depending on the amount of gain you apply, depends on the Q. So if we go for, say, a wide Q here and it's down low, as I pull it up, it narrows the Q. So even though I can have a very wide Q here, as I go more gain, it suddenly starts to narrow the Q down. So that's what they mean by proportional. So it's based on how much gain is there. So the less gain, the wider the Q, and it gets sharper. Now, it's still represented as the same number. It doesn't actually change the Q's number, but just visually you can see that it is actually changing it. And these exact settings apply to all 8 of those bands. So you can do all of that on all of those 8 bands. Now, the dynamic mode. This is basically the best way to describe this is it's like a compressor for EQ. So how it works is that we can turn it on. We can determine our setting to be either down or up. We even have the ability to set a side chain, which I'm not really going to go into that at the moment, but that's basically where the plugin is listening to another track to determine the, let's say, compression, but it's not compression, the dynamic EQ. And we have a threshold. So it adjusts how much EQ it applies on this threshold. So that's where it's sort of like a compressor. Once the audio signal goes above the threshold, it will then do something based on this dynamic mode. So to give you an idea of that, if I play this song and then I'll boost the EQ, you'll hear what it sounds like. All right, so now if we put our dynamics on, what we can actually do is we say, okay, I want to boost that section, but once the song gets too loud in this section, so it goes over this threshold, we want to then pull our EQ setting down so that we're not adding so much of this frequency anymore. So let me play with the threshold. So turn that down for a minute. So if I put the threshold all the way up to the top, you'll see the signal never goes above it and it's doing nothing. As I bring it down, as soon as the signal starts going over, you'll see this white line starts coming down. So it's dragging our EQ setting down and reducing the amount of boost that we are applying. Now, if we reverse that and we put it into up mode, we get the total opposite. We add none of this EQ except when it goes above the threshold. So we're sort of reversing the concept there. So say 90% of the song, we are not going to boost any EQ, but occasionally when the EQ goes above that, we might boost it a little bit more. Now, going up in that way is not something that I would generally do. I generally work in the other way because most of the time, say for instance, you want to, as an example, let's say we want to warm up our overall song. We want to make it a little bit warmer, but we're concerned that when the kick or the bass comes in and adds a lot more of that warmth, it makes the song too warm or too muddy. So what we do is we set our threshold so that when the kick or the bass comes in and adds that low end, we then back off on our EQ. When the kick and the bass disappear Our EQ then fully presents that boost to warm up our track. So let me just show you what I mean by warming this song up. So if we sort of warm it up a bit, we're boosting our EQ, we've got our threshold all the way up or our dynamics off altogether. So we like that warmth that we're adding there, but it's a little bit much when the kick and the bass are playing some of the notes. So you can see here, it's doing boosts in between some of the notes on the bass. It's doing the full boost, but then when the bass hits, it pulls down and takes a little bit of this EQ away so that we're not adding any more. So this is obviously a bit exaggerated, but you can see what I'm talking about here. So this can sort of give you a bit more consistency with your low end, keeping it nice and level. So when the bass disappears, the EQ pops in. When the bass comes in, the EQ pulls down so that we're not adding any more. Now you can go the other way. So let's say with this number 3 here, we can go down to do a cut. Okay, but when we do a cut here, it sort of works a little bit differently. So when you did a boost before, it was boosting all the time and then reducing how much it boosted when the signal went over it, unless we switched it to up. If we switched it to up, then it worked the opposite way around. So with it down, when we pull it down, it works the other way in theory. So we can set a cut here, but normally it will not be cutting the signal unless the signal goes above the threshold, and then we cut it down. So for instance, you might have a vocal track where it's really nice and warm. You like the low end of the vocal, but occasionally it gets a little bit too muddy or a little bit too boomy. So you might make a setting here, have a cut here, set your threshold so that it only gets activated when you get to those little boomy sections, and you will see that this white line will start to pull down. So every time it goes over the threshold, it will start to reduce. It will start to do a cut of the EQ setting that's based on this. So let's show that. Now that can also be very handy on vocals. Say, you might say in the 1 or 2K, they might get a bit nasally sounding in certain sections, or they might sound really good normally, but as soon as they go into a belting part, a bit too much 4K or 2K comes out in their vocals. So you might set it to a threshold that it does nothing for most of the song until they belt some notes. And as soon as they belt some notes, it pulls down and does a cut in that section to take out those harsh bits that come out only when they're belting certain notes. So a dynamic EQ can be very good for that, because you're not always EQing the signal across the entire song. You're just doing it for the parts that you need it to do it. Now, when you're doing a cut, if we were to switch it to up, then it would work in the opposite way. It would be cutting all the time, but as soon as it goes over to the threshold, it would reduce the cut. Now, where you might use that is you might say, let's go down to the kick, and you might say that I want to reduce the low end when the kick is not playing, but as soon as the kick plays, I want to reduce this cut. So you'll see every time the kick hits, it jumps up to reduce the cut so that it allows the kick to go through a bit. Now, again, I've over-exaggerated and are cutting lots, but that's the concept of it. And you have the ability to do that on any of the bands. So all of the bands can be individually set to be either a standard EQ or it can be a dynamic EQ. So each one can be independent. So it can be dynamic or not dynamic. So you can see why this plugin is so powerful. It gives you so many options here. Okay, so we've got a couple other settings here. We have this soft saturation setting here. And basically the manual is just stating that it's inspired by British style inductor EQ, and it adds a little bit of non-linear harmonic saturation at the input of the equalizer. So if we turn all of these off, let's see if we can actually hear a difference just by turning this setting on and off. Okay, if it does anything, it is very subtle. I'm struggling to hear that, but that might be something to play with anyway, to see if you can add any sort of texture to that. Okay, some other useful features that can be quite handy in here is that, let's say you have your song playing. If we hold down the Alt key and click somewhere on the spectrum, we can basically be able to search around and listen to just that frequency range there. Okay, we can obviously reset everything back to normal, which is easy. Now we have a learn control here. So this can be handy to get it to attempt to tell you the main points of EQ on that instrument, where the key focus should be by you. So being a whole song, it's going to really struggle there. So let's get out of this and find an instrument. So if we play our drum and then we click on learn, it should pinpoint you to the frequencies that you could be looking at for either cutting or boosting or whatever else. It's sort of doing an analysis of what it's hearing and what frequencies are being used by that instrument and where you should target your EQ settings. So you'll see where it's done here. It's sort of indicated where you could put a shelf and some other bands that might be important to you. So you could test those theories out by boosting them. So obviously number one there, it's targeted the real low end thump. A little bit of boxiness there. Yeah, a bit of boxiness there. And 7 is sort of our clicky end of the kick. So it's targeted those quite nicely there. So that learn setting can be quite helpful for you to quickly give you a guide, especially when you're learning, to what frequencies you might want to look at in regards to boosting or cutting, if need be, to change the quality of your instrument. We then have this masking setting here. So this is an interesting one because it allows us to determine if there's any instruments masking each other in the frequency range. So really, to do this, you need at least 2 tracks. So let's say we have a bass track here. And on this bass track, I'm also going to load Neutron. And we'll turn that off. And to make it easily visible, I'm going to actually name this to be bass. And I'm just going to close that one. And then I'm going to name this one kick. And now if I activate the masking section here and I open this, I can see here the other instances or tracks that have a Neutron plugin on. So song 6 was obviously our original one that we were using before, and this is our new one. We've got bass. So if I click on bass, now we open up 2 windows. The top one here is the track that we're looking at, which is the kick. The bottom one is the one that we are now referencing in the masking, which is the bass. And if we play them together, we will start to get a reading of how it's masking. We have this sensitivity control here, so we can go low or go high to see how much masking the meter will show us. So if I bring the sensitivity up, you'll see that it's starting to find some frequencies that it believes are being masked. Now I've gone pretty high here. So if I go quite low, it's not really giving us anything here to say that it's masking. But just for the point of this exercise here, I'll go pretty high. So that's definitely a frequency there that could be looked at. So we can do a couple of things here. We can say, okay, there I want to target, and I'm going to decide that I want the kick to control that section. So I'm going to do a boost there. And that might be all you want to do. But the other thing you can do is that you can click on this inverse link. And what that does is that any movement I make on this one will do the exact inverse on the other one. So if we say this is around that frequency range that popped up before, I'm going to do a boost on the kick, which is then going to do a cut on the bass in that section. So it's still saying that it's doing it there. We could go even higher if we wanted to. So it's not really masking anymore. Obviously, it's not quite natural. Keep in mind also this kick and bass are not from the same song, so they don't even match. But you'll hear there the kick is really loud now and that. But you get the idea of what this masking can do. In this case here, they're not the same song. They're not really masking each other because I've had to take the sensitivity up quite high. But the concept's there, and it can be a guide if you're struggling to get a couple of instruments to sit together. It doesn't have to be bass and kick either. It can be 2 guitar tracks. You could find 2 guitar tracks and do the exact same concept, which I'll do in a second. But what we can also do is we can bypass both of these EQs instantly with this control. Now, it's not a toggle switch. You have to actually hold it down. So as I was clicking, it was just flashing because it was stopping bypassing. But if I hold it down, it goes back to normal. And we can continue on making other EQ settings. We could continue on doing the inverse link, or we could say, okay, we want an inverse link there. Now I'm going to turn that inverse link off because now I just want to do a boost here, a cut here, and whatever else. So this masking thing can be quite handy in that regard there. If we find two guitar tracks, so now let's load Neutron. So I've loaded the plugin on both guitars. I'm just going to close those down and just have the one guitar open here. Now, if I go to masking, this is on guitar 1 and I pick guitar 2, we can now play that and see what we get. So let's start off quite low with the sensitivity. So let's say there's a bit of a problem. Again, these are not from the same song. So please excuse the actual horrible noise that's making. So again, we could do a boost and a cut there. And we could have another listen. But you also can do it opposite. You don't have to have one winning both. So you might say, okay, I've got two guitars here and they're sort of masking each other a bit. They're using the same frequencies across the board. So what I'm going to do is this one here we saw was a problem. I'm going to go this way. So this guitar is going to be boosted on this one. This one's going to be cut on this one. But then you might say, okay, the next section I want to look at is this one. Or maybe it's even higher. So you might then go opposite. So you'll say this one's going to tackle the low end, this one's going to tackle the mid or higher mids. So we've done a cut at this range, which has done a boost at the other one. Now, in this regard here, I wouldn't do this one here because it is quite muddy here. I would actually probably have cut both of these in this range because it's not a very good range. It's quite low end. So you might have one do the bright top end and the other one not do that, so you can cut that out. So you have all this control here and masking. So this is a very bad example. Like I said, these guitar parts aren't from the same song, so didn't quite come out, but hopefully the concept is there and hopefully it makes sense to you. So that's the EQ. As I said, very powerful. If you've got Neutron, check this out. Hopefully it's been helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.